Hello, Internet. The following is my first example of a possible narration for this book that I've written called An Idiot's Guide to Time Control. I have my microphone out with its pop filter and everything, but the room is a bit echoey, so forgive me if it doesn't sound of studio quality. But I will be narrating the whole first chapter for your enjoyment. So, enjoy. Chapter 1. When Dale made the mistake. Dale stared. He'd been staring for several seconds. Really, it seemed like the kind of thing you'd stare at. "Well, what do you say to that?" asked the man standing in front of Dale. Dale's stare, which had by no means changed, shifted its attention from the man himself and to the small piece of paper in his hand. It was a contract, this obvious by the word contract written helpfully upon it. By the way he wiggled it impatiently in Dale's face, Dale assumed this meant he expected him to sign it. Dale managed to blink, then turned his stare back up to the strange man again. "Can I have some?" Dale asked. "Some of what?" The man frowned. "Some of whatever drug you're on. I mean, you're clearly high if you expect me to believe anything you've just said, so I was wondering whether I could get some," Dale explained, leaning on the counter of his antique store. The man who had not identified himself, apart from saying he was the Lord of all space-time, frowned further. "I'm not on a drug, I'm really offering you this," he said, wiggling the contract again. "Okay, well, in that case, you really should be on some assortment of drugs. Just different ones. Especially if you think you're the king of time and space," Dale said, giving him a motherly look. The one that said, "Stop being silly, young man." "Lord of space-time, not king of time and space," the Lord of space-time corrected. "Right, and I'm the disco doctor," Dale said with a condescending smile. The Lord of Space-Time, who looked more like an accountant who needed exercise, gritted his teeth. "How about a demonstration?" he suggested. "Knock yourself out. Physically, if you feel like it," Dale smiled. The Lord of Space-Time brought up his other hand and snapped his fingers with a very determined motion. Dale stared as nothing seemed to happen. Not that he'd expected anything to happen, but the store wasn't very busy, so it didn't bother him if the man wanted to waste his time. Of course, the guy was clearly insane, and Dale had already tapped the silent alarm button while they'd been talking, so there wasn't much else to do than entertain this fellow's delusions. "Impressive," Dale said. "Making time go forwards at a regular pace, are you?" Dale asked, reaching for his coffee and bringing it to his lips. "I've frozen time, actually," the Lord of Space-Time told him, self-satisfaction dripping from his smirk. "Oh, strange. We don't seem to be frozen," Dale observed, glancing around. "Except everything in this room," the Lord of Space-Time amended. "That explains it. I was confused there for a second," Dale said, clearly unimpressed. "You don't believe me?" the Lord of Space-Time realized. "No, of course I do. I mean, nobody would claim they were the Time Emperor, would they? Therefore, you must be him," Dale said, looking completely serious. "About time you believe me," the Lord of Space-Time grunted, rolling his eyes. "Well, apart from the fact that the place is empty, so there isn't much difference between frozen and normal time, and the fact that people claim crazy stuff all the time," Dale added, smirking. "But yeah, apart from those two facts, I believe you." He winked. The Lord of Space-Time, who Dale believed would require a specially tailored straitjacket to accommodate his big belly, didn't look happy now. "You know," the Lord of Space-Time began, "divine beings such as myself don't like it when mortals make fun of us." Dale beamed. "But I'm not a mortal. I'm the deity of the disco. I thought I already told you. I mean, I can give you a demonstration if you want," Dale countered. The Lord of Space-Time gave him a flat and quite annoyed stare, but didn't answer. Dale held out his finger and widened his eyes for a moment, then slowly circled it around and moved it gracefully to the right. "Behold, the power of disco," Dale said dramatically, dancing his finger around until it hit the CD player on the counter. He tapped a button. "Well, you can tell by the way I use my walk, I'm a woman's man, no time to talk," the radio blared. "And lo, disco is brought forth from the nothingness," Dale said, sipping his coffee again. The Lord of Space-Time straightened, staring intently at Dale as his face went red. He looked like he was going to have an aneurysm. "Mockery. I think I need to teach you a lesson," he said, before bringing up his other hand again and once more snapping his fingers. Around him, Dale heard the simultaneous alarms of every clock he owned. Since his store was an antique shop, this was not a small number of clocks. Cuckoos did their thing, grandfathers donged loudly, and wind-ups rang harshly. It made him jump, to be sure, and for a split second his more superstitious side entertained the notion this man was indeed the sovereign of time and space. But it was brief, and drowned out by reason swiftly thereafter. His eyes darted around at the clocks going off. They all read 8 o'clock. He glanced at his wristwatch and found it read the same. He couldn't remember what time precisely it had been earlier, but it sounded about right. "Behold my power," the Lord of Space-Time announced, smirking victoriously. Dale settled back down once the clocks did the same. Then he took up his coffee and sipped, as he looked over the strange crazy guy who was now holding his arms aloft, as if awaiting veneration for his prowess. Dale licked his lips and smiled kindly at the guy. "I take it back. You are definitely the overlord of where and when. I bow before your might." "Well, I would, but I have a bad back," Dale said. "So you should, but I am a benevolent being, and that's why I'm here, as I mentioned," the Lord of Space-Time said, smiling to himself and straightening his suit. It was a nice suit, Dale had to admit. Very clean. Dale wondered who he stole it from. Crazy people don't really have much money in his experience. If they do, they're not crazy anymore. They're just eccentric. "Clearly, and I do appreciate you keeping time going as you do. Keep up the good work, O Master of Temporality. Yet this mere mortal cannot help but wonder what possible deeds might have brought it to such a divine being's attention," Dale said, offering an incline of his head that was sarcastic to the extreme. Though judging by the winning smile and slightly proud shoulder adjusting, the Lord of Space-Time hadn't picked up on it. "Think nothing of it. So if you appreciate the effort that goes into such a thing, and I'm glad to see you in that minority. It's one of the reasons I picked you. You have a keen love of time, don't you?" the Lord of Space-Time asked. "Undoubtedly. I would be your prophet if I didn't have to run this shop, and feed myself, and watch TV, and all those other things in life," Dale shrugged. "But take that away, and I'd be right there in the worshipping business. Alas, I actually have a life," Dale said, grimacing sadly. Inside, Dale was wondering how long it would take for the police to get here and cart the madman away. He was polite enough, but was definitely not stable. Dale wasn't keen on instability. It was far too unpredictable for his liking. "Naturally. So, will you?" the Lord of Space-Time asked, feeling much more comfortable with his decision of this particular man. It had taken a little longer than he'd expected, but the man had realized his position well enough. He considered that the entertainment industry might have some sway on his disbelief. It hadn't been this hard in previous generations, and he already knew it would be harder in the following ones. He didn't look too deeply into the future, though. It was prone to flux. Which, he reflected, was the reason he was here in the first place. "Will I what?" Dale responded cheerfully. "Take my mantle for this generation," the Lord of Space-Time reiterated. "Oh, that!" Dale barked in sudden remembrance. "Oh, I couldn't possibly. I'm clearly not worthy," Dale told him, looking dramatically shocked at the idea. "Oh, of course you are. That's why I'm asking you. You have all the marks," the Lord of Space-Time said, ticking off fingers as he proceeded to run through them. "Seventh son of a seventh son, born at midnight under a crescent moon, virgin. It's all quite clear. You even run a shop that concerns itself with objects out of time. You were born for this." "Virgin? I'm not a virgin," Dale said. He was relatively certain he wasn't. He'd gotten very drunk and woken up in bed with Claire Santiago, and she was definitely of the opinion he hadn't disappointed. Of course, he couldn't quite remember the event, but he was certain enough to dispute this loon's claim. He was certain there had been other occasions, but again, he'd been so drunk they may not count. Dale somehow knew exactly what to say to women when he'd had a few. Any other time, and the words just didn't work right. "What do you mean you're not a virgin? Of course you're a virgin." The Lord of Space-Time frowned in confusion. "I fear you have your facts wrong. I can assure you I'm not a virgin," Dale said, cocking a brow. "It seems you might have the wrong fellow. You should try the burger shop across the street. Plenty of virgins behind the counter there," Dale said, gesturing at the door. "But I wouldn't ask them if I were you. You might get arrested," he added, stage whispering with the back of his hand. There passed a long few seconds as Dale sipped at his coffee, and the Lord of Space-Time stared confoundedly at him. The Lord of Space-Time went through several expressions. He frowned, turned his eyes about as if thinking heavily. Then he pulled his head back and looked askance at Dale. Dale just smiled at him, wondering if the silent alarm button was broken, and he was waiting for someone who'd never show up. Eventually, the Lord of Space-Time shook his head to himself and then set his eyes back on Dale. His lips quirked a little. "Oh, I see," he said slowly, winking at Dale. "Definitely not a virgin. Right, I get you." He winked again. Several times. "What's wrong with your eye?" Dale asked, his lips curling a bit in disgust. "Nothing. Not virgin," the Lord of Space-Time said. He was still winking. "Are you having a stroke or something?" Dale asked, feeling distinctly uncomfortable with a fat accountant about twice his age winking at him with a smirk. A crazy fat accountant winking at him with a smirk and talking about whether or not Dale was a virgin. He wondered if anyone would feel comfortable with that. "No, I'm fine, and you're definitely not a virgin, right?" the Lord of Space-Time said, smirking and giving a double wink. "Right. Okay, then," Dale mumbled, glancing nervously at the door and then glancing down at his watch. Surely they should have turned up by now. Dale believed he was going to have to keep humouring the nutcase. "So what's this about a contract?" Dale asked, changing the subject. The Lord of Space-Time flicked the contract out again, a parchment type of thing which curled at the top and bottom. The words written upon it were italic and difficult to read. He placed it on the counter and slid it towards Dale for his perusal. Dale took out his glasses from his pocket, pulled a serious face, and coughed a little before taking up the paper. He didn't actually need glasses, and the lenses were empty anyway. He wore them to convince people he knew something about what he was looking at. He often had to pretend something was less than it really was when people brought in rarities. Though he wasn't fond of the comparison, Dale knew running an antique shop was very similar to running a pawn shop, the only difference being whether or not something was covered in blood. "I've tried to make it as clear as possible," the Lord of Space-Time explained, jabbing a finger at each bullet point written on the parchment. "I understand this generation has a short attention span, so it's only 3 points long, though that's just the basics. I have an appendix of rules and terminology which you'll receive after you sign it," he went on, pulling a feather from his pocket and laying it beside the parchment along with an ink pot. Dale hadn't been sure where the ink pot had come from, but the guy was pretty loony, so for all he knew the fellow had pigeons in his pockets for special occasions. Dale read the contract and nodded sagely at the 3 points. 1. Keep stuff going as it should, Dale read aloud. 2. Don't tangle the timeline, it's hard to straighten out again. And 3. Don't mess with Death, she has anger issues. "Definitely remember the last one," the Lord of Space-Time winced. "All seems fairly straightforward," Dale agreed, tapping the contract and looking back up at the madman. "Of course, I have a few questions, if you don't mind." "By all means," the Lord of Space-Time smiled agreeably. Nice to finally meet one of you who thinks about this stuff rather than just grabbing the power and misusing it. I hate the clean-up during the probationary period."
Dale tapped the first point as he spoke. "Keep stuff going as it should. That's rather vague. How are we defining stuff, and who decides what it should be like?"
"Hit the nail on the head right out of the bag," the Lord of Space-Time began. "Stuff is the multiplicity of all motion and energy within the universe, though your domain will stop at the stratosphere of your planet, of course, since your species doesn't possess meaningful space travel yet. So, naturally, astronauts don't concern you, neither do cosmic events. That's someone else's business," the Lord of Space-Time explained, appearing to Dale to get into lecturing mode. It was good from his perspective. The more he talked, the less Dale had to worry about him going into a psychotic murder spree. You never could tell with madmen. "As for the usual progression of events, that's up for some debate. As the ruler of this section of space-time, your discretion will be somewhat loose, just so long as you don't let any cataclysmic paradoxical events occur. Or, at least, if they somehow happen, you'll fix it on your own. If I have to get involved, that'll count against you. 3-strike rule there. Ruin things 3 times in a row, and we'll have to go right back to this moment, and you'll never have met me. Clear enough?" the Lord of Space-Time asked with an inquiring head tilt.
"So I'll be able to move time around? Like, visit the past and future?" Dale asked, wanting to laugh at the crazy conversation and most especially how seriously the man before him was taking it.
"Well, you can, I suppose," the Lord of Space-Time grunted uncomfortably. "Don't do it too often, though, or you'll hit the second rule and make things very messy. Easier if you just stick to the same day if you have to travel through time. Can't ruin things too badly that way," he explained with a shrug.
"What if I kill Hitler?" Dale asked, strangely fascinated with this conversation. Crazy or not, the man was an interesting chat. If nothing else, it was better than trying to tell an 80-year-old woman that her husband's service medal isn't worth as much as a house. Not even a small one. No, not even a caravan. Sorry.
"Hitler? Who's that?" the Lord of Space-Time asked.
"You don't know who Hitler is?" Dale asked with a shock. Even crazy people know about Hitler. Or at least Dale had thought so.
"No. Why, did he do something chronologically important?" the Lord of Space-Time asked.
"He did nearly conquer the world and instigated mass genocide. I would assume that's rather important to the timeline," Dale supplied. The Lord of Space-Time held out a hand and waggled it from side to side in an uncertain gesture.
So, he said. "Did he cause geographic shifts in his efforts?"
"He was trying to make an atom bomb. Nearly succeeded, I understand," Dale informed him.
"Nearly" being the important word there. Since it didn't cause any lasting planetary change, you could comfortably kill the man from that angle. Though since you mentioned genocide, I'd have to ultimately suggest you don't. If you start interfering with death a little too often, she'll get angry and throw a tantrum. Saving or condemning a single person or even a small group of people won't matter too badly. She can recoup her losses or spend her gains elsewhere without grumbling too much. But if you interfere with anything larger than 10 people, she'll come and have harsh words with you. And me for letting you do it, and then I'll have to clean it up if you can't figure out how."
The Lord of Space-Time rolled his eyes. "Okay, so I can save a baby from a burning building, but I can't save an orphanage?" Dale asked, frowning a little.
"Sounds callous when you put it like that. But essentially, yes. Death doesn't play favourites and doesn't distinguish between anyone, ever. But at least you can save someone if that's your thing."
The Lord of Space-Time shrugged.
"You'll get that out of your system after a few decades, though. Too many people to save. But that's a lesson I can't teach you. You have to learn it yourself."
Dale paused for a moment, taken back by the way the man seemed to have a very sensible grasp of his own madness. Still, he wasn't pulling out a blood-stained hammer and saying he was here to look at Dale's brain, so he ploughed straight on. "Okay, so what if I travel through time and meet myself?" Dale asked.
"And?"
the Lord of Space-Time asked, unconcerned. "Well, won't that cause a paradox?" Dale asked.
"No, it'll jump into what you might call a bootstrap event,"
the Lord of Space-Time told him. "I don't understand," Dale admitted. As the master of time and space within your domain, your life is guarded against self-destruction. You can't murder yourself, for example. You'll simply be unable to do it. Try and travel to a time and place where you previously were, and stick a knife in your back, and you'll just find yourself not doing anything. The power stops you from such eventualities. However, if you go back and tell yourself not to walk across the street, you'll realise that you only went across that street because someone told you not to. No matter what you do, everything in your life that you try to change will only cause it to happen. You'll be disconnected from the timeline, after a fashion, so your life is predetermined no matter what you try to change. Go back and give yourself a lottery ticket. That will only result in you having won the lottery, and therefore you bought a shop with the winning ticket, only to find yourself here again. Then you gain the power, go back in time, and give yourself a lottery ticket, and so on the loop goes. Bootstrap 101.
The Lord of Space-Time rattled off as if he'd explained this 1,000 times, which he had. Dale squinted and considered before his next question. What if I go forwards in time and bring something back to the present? Dale asked.
That could go either way. Depends on what the changes might be. If you attempted to claim the invention as your own, you'd hit the bootstrap rule again. If you gave it to a previous version of yourself, then you've already invented it and were predetermined to go forwards and give it to your younger self, and nobody will ever have truly invented it. It'll just keep skipping backwards in time and was always meant to. Don't do that too often, though. It'll tangle the timeline, and I'll have to come and straighten it out since you're directly involved and therefore can't correct it yourself.
The Lord of Space-Time mused, nodding to himself, before shrugging a little as he went on.
On the other hand, if you gave it to someone else, you'd split the timeline to an alternate stream, and that future will fail to materialise as it was originally destined. This would create a new future, and you'll strain the fabric of reality a little. After a while, it'll settle back down, but if you do it enough, you'll tear something, and then I'll have to get involved. Frankly, it's better if you don't do that sort of thing. But I'm not here to regulate your behaviour. I'm simply here to make sure someone is looking after this part of the universe, so I don't have to. I have a busy schedule, and I don't really want to have to constantly keep things going as they should. That's your job once you sign the contract,
the Lord of Space-Time told him. Dale glanced at his watch, realised he'd been chatting with this loon for over an hour, and no police had yet turned up. That settled it. The button was broken. He felt a note of panic for a moment, suspecting he'd had to deal with this guy on his own. The shop was pretty quiet, so he couldn't exactly make subtle motions to the other customers to call the police themselves. It was all up to him. Okay then, I'll take the job, Dale said enthusiastically, taking up the quill and dipping it in the ink pot.
Fantastic. I was beginning to think you weren't interested,
the Lord of Space-Time admitted, as Dale scribbled someone else's name on the parchment. He blew on it for show and smiled at the man, handing back his quill. Do I get a copy of the contract? He asked. It seemed the sensible formality.
Along with these,
the Lord of Space-Time said, his arms laden with several heavy and old-looking books which he thumped onto the counter out of nowhere.
These are your guides to anything you might need to know. Thanks for your time and good luck,
the man declared, smiling and nodding at him, before snatching up the contract that he put on the counter and pulling it apart. To Dale's shock, it split into two identical copies of the same parchment, neither damaged, and both displaying his fake signature. The Lord of Space-Time rolled up one copy for himself, put the other copy down on the counter before Dale, and gestured to the mountain of books.
Better get reading. I'd freeze time while you do, or you'll never get through them, he said.
Dale glanced at the books, frowned, and then turned back to the crazy guy. But he was gone. Dale craned his head over the counter, looking from left to right, but there were no sign of him. Hey! He shouted in the air. No one responded, and Dale frowned as he darted around the counter to the door. It jangled the old-fashioned bell at the top, which Dale realised he hadn't heard when the man had disappeared. The street outside was silent. Not silent as in quiet. Silent. He glanced up the road and saw a car sitting mutely on it, a small cloud of smoke hanging behind its exhaust. After a second of staring, Dale realised the smoke was dissipating.
After a second of staring, Dale realized the smoke was not dissipating. It was literally frozen there. He walked up to the car and glanced over the driver, who was on his phone with his mouth open and his other hand on the steering wheel. He wasn't moving. Not even an inch. "Excuse me," Dale said, tapping on the driver's side window and glancing around to make sure no other cars were coming his way. But just like the unmoving man, who seemed unable to move or even notice him, the other cars on the road were dead still. And so were their drivers. Dale felt his heart beating faster in his chest, his blood pressure increasing as he felt panic override his thoughts. "No way," Dale whispered to himself, turning and looking for any sign of movement. There were signs of it, but they were mid-movement, frozen just like the car. A cyclist was stationary on the pavement, held up and as still as lake water. A dog was pissing up a tree, a thin trail of bubbled urine suspended in the air. Dale approached and touched the dog's tail. It moved with his finger, but went still once he let go, a small parting of the hair where his finger had touched it. He peered down into the dog's eyes, but the eyes didn't move either. Dale tapped one of the bubbles of urine and it wobbled for a moment, slowly shifting around with his finger. But again, once he stopped pushing it, it no longer moved at all. No momentum, no burst of the bubble. It just hung there, dislocated from the dotted pattern of the dog's inclinations. Dale fell back onto his backside with the shock of it. The truth he was now coming to realize but was determined to ignore somehow. His breathing grew heavy and his eyes spun around, seeking something, anything that moved of its own accord. Pedestrians with one foot in the air and their hands in their pockets. Children mid-jump over chalk-based games drawn on the pavement. Birds stiffly still in the air as if simply models held up by invisible string. Nothing was moving. Nothing. Except him. It was too much. "Move," Dale whispered desperately to everything. Nothing happened. "Something move," Dale demanded, staring at the pissing dog. A small quiver came from the water droplets, but they didn't flow through the air. "Move!" Dale screamed in panic. The world flashed back into motion around him. The dog leapt from the strange man that had appeared. The birds flapped as though uninterrupted. The children landed and leapt again without concern. The cars hit speed suddenly, startling Dale, but the most shocking thing was the noise. Everything had been like cotton wool in his ears until it had all started moving again. It assaulted his senses like a brick to the face. The sound of people talking, shoes clicking on the ground, children screaming at each other or laughing, the dog barking for Dale's interruption. Everything came alive again, and Dale couldn't decide if madness was contagious. What he did decide was that he had hallucinated and blamed the coffee back in his store. The thought of the store made him pull himself to his feet and walk hurriedly to it for its comforting familiarity. The place was quiet and still at the best of times, and once he got to it, he felt better for the noise no longer assaulting him. He closed the door, fumbled with the close sign and locked it before leaning on the counter and taking long, deep breaths. "It's in your head. Just in your head," Dale repeated under his breath. He closed his eyes, took a steadying breath, and then opened them. In a corner of his vision, he found the pile of books and the contract. Nope, they were still there. He closed his eyes again, slapped his face, then opened them. The books were still there. "Okay, this is real," Dale told himself, walking over to the contract and looking at it seriously for the first time. He talked to himself, as he thought, as if to make sure he was thinking properly by gauging how it sounded. Right. He was probably some crazy old guy who slipped me from drugs that caused these hallucinations. But he might have actually been Lord of Time and Space. Yeah, right, he muttered, taking up the contract. He looked at the fake signature. Well, even if it really was, God help me for saying it, the Lord of Space and Time, at least I didn't sign my real name. You can't hold me to a contract with someone else's. Dale trailed off as the name P.G. Tippings slowly glowed and shifted as if the ink were liquid again. It rearranged to show a new name and stopped glowing thereafter. Name. Dale finished reading the new name on the contract. Dale Ickerson. Dale stared between the name on the contract, the books on the counter, and the door with the world outside. It was several minutes before Dale found the will to do more than stare. So there you are. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And if I get enough positive feedback and enough soundproofing and time and all sorts of other things and practice and editing, blah, 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 I might actually narrate the whole thing and upload it to Audible. So, yeah, tell me what you think. Tell me, I know there were a couple of errors in there, but that's just because I couldn't be bothered to comb through the whole half hour of it. And I did that all in one recording, so no editing at all. Fresh and clean and raw. So yeah, tell me what you think in the comment section. Subscribe, blah, 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 blah. All that stupid stuff you're supposed to say on YouTube now. And thanks for listening. The book's available on Amazon, by the way, for 99p. And it's free this week. What is it today? The 16th of January. So it's free, I think, until the 22nd. So if you want the book for free, go and get it. There you go. Cutting my own throat for you guys. Hope you appreciate it.